Welcome to Think Bigger Voices, hosted by Jennie Treby and co-produced by Tony DiBenedetto. We're on a mission to break the cycle of poverty for kids in America by inspiring education, advocacy, and action in our communities. We'll tackle big subjects, talk to the experts, and promote the solutions making an impact. Join us if you believe that every kid deserves the opportunity to think bigger.
I'm Jennie Treby. Welcome to Think Bigger Voices. Today we're talking about food and how our land of plenty isn't so for so many kids. We know that 13 million kids in the United States suffer from food insecurity, and 1 in 5 are hungry. 100% of counties in the United States face food insecurity. Our expert today is the president and CEO of one of the nation's largest food banks. He was also named one of the most admired CEOs in Tampa Bay. Welcome, Thomas Mantz from Feeding Tampa Bay.
Well, thanks for having me. I didn't know you were going to throw that last thing in there, but certainly happy to be here with you and have a conversation about what we both know is a really important subject.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate it. Let's start by just tell us a little bit about you and your role at Feeding Tampa Bay.
Well, I'll start in reverse. So I think for a person that sits in my seat, your role really is probably twofold, but it falls under the same header. So most importantly, I would say that I build capacity, right? So when you think about a cause like Feeding Tampa Bay's, you want to build capacity, meaning organizationally, can you do what's necessary to live into the strategic plans, the obligations, the opportunity that your particular mission has. But more than anything else, and why we're happy to be with you today, is that all causes need community support, right? Great changes happen when a large number of people that are like-minded and causes that we believe in lean in and push really hard. And the way we think about this and the way I think about my job is to do both of those, to make sure that our organization can live into its obligations and responsibilities, but also to make sure the community understands just what exactly is the problem or opportunity and what might we do about it collectively.
So, tell us a little bit more about Feeding Tampa Bay, your mission, your vision, and you have a new look as well.
We do. I think one of the things I believe about nonprofit organizations like ours is they need to continue to evolve. I've been now in the nonprofit world for 25 years after a career in for-profit. And in both industries, if you're not evolving towards the needs of communities, customers, clients, neighbors, then you're not really considering ongoing challenges, changes in communities. Our communities have changed rapidly, particularly in the 25 years that I've been in this business. And so our work has evolved. Even in Feeding Tampa Bay's viewpoint, if you had asked us 10 years ago, would we ever be in the business of doing anything other than food, we would have said, no, that's not our best calling, our best use, or where we ought to be. 10 years later, we're a multi-service organization. So in answer to your question, our view, our vision is to build healthy communities today and for generations to come. Notice in that sentence, the word food does not exist there. We want healthy communities for today and generations to come. And our vision, how we think we're going to get there, is that we build people-focused solutions. How do we connect, collect, and build resources that start to address and attack these causes at depth? You know, when you think about the statistics that you mentioned, Jennie, I shared this with our board. Actually, let me share a different story because I think it's more illustrative. My colleague in Central Florida that ran the food bank there, one of the champions of our industry, retired a couple of years ago. And one of the things he shared with me was that when he got to the food bank in Central Florida, they had, I don't remember the exact number, but they had something around 250,000 kids who were considered food insecure. And when he left, there were closer to 500,000 or 600,000. And he said, what did I do all these years? You know, what was I doing? And the answer was good, important work, but the problem is growing at a greater pace than resources are. And it's something that I think we have to start to reconcile as communities. Think about it from our perspective at Feeding Tampa Bay. 12 years ago when I got there, I think we were providing somewhere around 15 million meals a year, if I recall right. Last year, we provided 85 million meals, and we're further behind as a percentage of need. So what business has grown its output by sevenfold, but has seen its customer base grow at a much greater rate? And so as we think about this, we have to step into what we think are solutions differently.
So what's the discrepancy?
The reality is, when you just look at the economics of the United States today, we wouldn't be saying anything groundbreaking here by saying that the concentration of wealth in certain areas across the United States has been terrific. Right. So for many people that listen to a podcast like this, hopefully their investments and their safety and security has increased. Right. But for many people, the basic cost of living has continued to escalate beyond their capacity. So you mentioned you had Jessica Miroff in here a couple of weeks ago, and we often cite the work that United Way does in their ALICE report. And I think this, more than any food insecurity number, is the number we pay attention to.
So wait, let me stop you right there. So for those people who don't know what ALICE is.
Thank you.
Right? Asset limited,
income
constrained,
but employed. Which is the bulk of people we serve. Again, if your listening audience could take one thing from this conversation today, we would tell you that in all likelihood, we're feeding someone that you know. That someone that you're aware of in your world is coming to see us for services. We can talk more a bit about that later, but importantly, as we think about that ALICE population, to finish that thought, their data would tell you that to survive as a family of four in the state of Florida, your household needs to earn around $91,000. And that sounds like a lot of money, but when you start to do the math around transportation or housing or daycare, basic expenses, these aren't folks that are taking extended trips somewhere. It's $91,000. The average family of four in the state of Florida today earns $58,000. If you want to understand the problem, there it is. And so families are having to cope with anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 a month gaps in their basic ability to live. And again, this is just basic survival budgets. Those folks more and more are in our care. When charitable relief organizations were started, the theory was helping out those who are in the worst possible place at the worst possible time. That percentage of folks we serve is by far the lowest. Most people we serve are involved in the economy every day, or as we would say to a business, we're either feeding your colleagues or your customers or both.
Wow. That's pretty powerful.
But true.
So tell us a little bit more about how you're feeding people.
Yeah. So I think that, I love the way you use the word there, because I think feeding in our viewpoint has a variety of different meanings today. Here's what we know. When someone comes to see us for food, that is almost never the problem in their household. It's the symptom they need the greatest relief from immediately. Right, so you have a variety of instability in your household. Perhaps you're struggling to make rent. Perhaps you have healthcare challenges. Perhaps there are a variety of other things going on. But the thing that will drive you into the social services safety net is food. I have to feed myself or my family today. So an organization like Feeding Tampa Bay sees far more people than all other social services charities. Far more, because that's what drives people into the network of services. But what happens there is most often people that come to us for food, we have not understood our opportunity and obligation to say, what else can we connect you with, understanding that this is not your only challenge. And so the way that our organization is moving is we are pivoting towards saying, okay, let's think about it from a for-profit lens. We have a huge customer base that has a wider variety of needs. How do we provide more services and resources? So the way that our world is shifting, and as I said, when you think about what our vision is, we want to build healthy communities today and for generations to come, right? So we want to connect, convene, build out services where when someone comes in for food, they walk out with food, but they also walk out with access to a wider variety of things. What does that mean in practical terms? When you come see us for food and you need a connection into a healthcare provider, our new facility actually has a medical clinic on staff. When you come in for food and you might need access to legal services, Bay Area Legal Services will be in our facility. See, we won't do these things. We're a food bank. You don't want us involved in medical or legal care, right? We would agree on that. But we can make sure the opportunity is available on a campus where now co-located services are available. And when someone comes in for one area of concern, we can address a variety of them, and hopefully the outcomes are much better.
So you're referencing, correct, your new Causeway Center.
Yes.
Right, which is the talk of Tampa Bay.
We
so
hope.
Walk us through what this facility is. And it sounds like it's more than a facility. It's a community. It sounds like it.
It is, Jenny. I think that the question also kind of is both a question of what did we do in practical fact, but what's also our theology. When we spent the last 5 or 6 years contemplating a new facility, we spent hours and hours, literally probably close to 1,000 hours in conversation with neighbors we serve, partners we work with, elected officials, donors, volunteers, staff members, board members, trying to understand what was needed in the community. We then also visited a wide variety of other food relief providers around the United States, and we came to one conclusion, which is Tampa Bay needed a community center that sat in the middle of all of this collective that I mentioned a moment ago. And so what the Causeway Center is, there's a big food bank in there. When you come visit us, you'll see a lot of racks and forklifts and a lot of movement of food, but just as much space is dedicated to education. We have a significant conference center that's dedicated to bringing people together to have conversation, resource training. On our campus, we have a restaurant, we have a grocery store, we have an entire neighborhood services area where all of these services I mentioned a moment ago, some 25 other nonprofits will be resident on campus with us. So we want to create a community center that brings as many people together as possible who need services, but also who provide services or other opportunities. Volunteers, folks like you all that have a particular mission you're interested in creating more awareness about or support for. We want to build a center that welcomes all of that in. And that was our vision. It was a big vision, a big lift. We believe our view of our responsibilities are unique in our industry, but we also were convinced it's the pathway to the future.
Well, it certainly makes sense. How about people how do they get to the center? And so this is a collection where people can come.
Yes.
But how do you serve people?
Radiate outward.
How do you go outward?
Yeah, so an organization like Feeding Tampa Bay has a defined territory we serve. So we have 10 counties, about 9,000 square miles. There's about 5.5 million people in that territory. But as you know, Florida's growing rapidly.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a pretty big footprint we're responsible for. And a good portion of the constituency, the neighbors we serve, won't come to Causeway Center. What Causeway Center, though, does is it builds a foundation that can then radiate out across the 10 different counties we serve. So let me use a simple example. We've almost more than tripled our capacity to store and move food. Well, most of that food goes into the other counties around us. But because we built a bigger facility in Hillsborough County, we're able to say, okay, we can now radiate those services outward. As we build partnerships and relationships in Hillsborough County at Causeway Center that are successful, we can work with those same partners in other parts of our community and start to create miniature hubs throughout our 10-county area as we, again, start to build support. Most resources, you want them to be local. When we think about how best to serve a neighbor, we always want to overcome 3 challenges that a neighbor has: time, distance, money. Right? Those are the 3 things that you and I may have enough of, but the people we serve never do. And so when we look to do anything, we want to be locally located. We want to be in places that neighbors are likely to be. We want to make sure that the resources are readily available. So think of Causeway Center in some ways as a terrific petri dish that helps us understand how does this ecosystem work, and then how do we take that ecosystem and move it into Polk County or Pasco County, South County and Hillsborough, or up in over in Highlands, or up in some of our northern counties. So those are the iterations moving out over time.
So let's talk a little bit about kids in particular, because that's our focus and our mission here. And I was hoping that you could explain the term food insecurity, because I think it's a term that we hear a lot.
Yeah.
And maybe we understand it and maybe we don't.
Yeah.
What is food insecurity?
So I'll give you the layman's way to think about it. You don't know when your next meal is coming or from whom it's coming. You have your food access is unpredictable. You don't have the same places that provide it to you. It's difficult for you to know when and where you'll get food, right? So that's food insecurity. And if you think about the word insecurity, it makes sense. The USDA definition is deeper and more important, and it generally says you don't have access to healthy foods and you can't acquire them in socially acceptable ways. So the important parts of that definition is access to healthy foods. That's a critical element to long-term success, particularly in the lives of children, right? But also acquiring them in socially acceptable ways. Let me share a story about kids. We have a research partnership with USF here in West Central Florida, and we asked them to do some work with us in the Pinellas County, one of our local counties, Pinellas County schools, high schools, to understand what food insecurity was happening there. If there's a group of kids that doesn't get attention around food insecurity, it's high schoolers.
And they're the kids who need to eat the most because they're hungry all the time.
Yes. And so we found a lot of interesting things. We found stories of heroism where high school kids never ate at home because they didn't want to take food from their younger siblings, right? Things that you just think no high school child should have to make these decisions. Yeah. But we also found that kids were making really difficult decisions like stealing food, stealing possessions to buy food, trading sexual favors to get food, something a high school student shouldn't have to do. So that's where you get the idea of socially acceptable ways of acquisition. So if you think about other stories that are familiar to us, people selling possessions to get food, right? So when you think about this definition of, the USDA definition of food insecurity, one, you don't have ongoing access to healthy food. And number two, you can't acquire it like you and I. When you go buy food, Jenny, what do?
I go to the store.
Yep. And you walk in and you pay for your items after you've selected them and you walk out. Imagine you can't do that. There's a significant portion of our population that can't do that. So there's a technical definition, but the real definition is I don't always have the money to buy food. I don't always have the places I can buy food from because I live in areas where it's not available to me. I don't always have knowledge of when I'm going to eat if I'm a child or a senior. And so its meaning is specific, but the depth of it is sometimes devastating.
How do you reach those high schoolers? How do you get the food to them?
A variety of different ways. And high schoolers are a tough group to get at. Because they will hide from food insecurity. One of the other things that came out of that study was a lot of high schools had programs in place to help children who were identified. Typically, teachers know in their classrooms who's food insecure. They know who's struggling with life and things of that nature. And so the teacher might be able to identify a child. And when the child would be referred for food assistance at school, they were referred to, They're referred to the cheese sandwich as the cheese sandwich kids because that's what they got, right? And just as awful as getting just a cheese sandwich may or may not be, the social stigma attached to being a cheese sandwich kid put most of those kids in a place where they didn't want to claim the sandwich. Well, it's not worth, right? So they're a difficult place for us to get to, but there's a way that we think about this. So one, we work with every food resource organization there is in the 10-county area. So we're getting food in through those places. But I'd like to share a different story with you, if I may, about how to take care of children and families. If you know anything about food relief, a familiar methodology of feeding, particularly kids in elementary schools, has been a backpack program. Are you familiar with this, right? They're very popular, particularly with donors. They're often seen as and they started because teachers came to food banks and said, I got kids, they don't start absorbing information until late Tuesday afternoon if I start feeding them on Monday. Think about that.
So to clarify with the backpack programs, are you talking about when they send kids home for the weekend with backpacks?
So the theory was take the kid, identify the kid through the school, and then give them a little backpack of food. Early on, they were literally backpacks. Over time, we would build out these little package items that would slip into a kid's backpack. And so think about pop-top cans, being able to open a granola bar, things of that nature, but something that a child could snack on that was supplemental over the course of a weekend, trying to blunt the trauma of not eating all weekend so that when a child showed back up at school, they would have an ability to engage in their scholastic opportunities. So we asked USF again to come in to say, how is this working? Is this successful? And so we did 2 different studies, one of which was at some schools in South County, Hillsborough. And USF came back to us with, I want to say 600 different data points, but 2 of them jumped out to us immediately. The first was 68% of the food was being eaten by the family on Friday night. Right? It wasn't the kid who was hungry, it was the whole family.
Sure.
The second thing we learned was that a lot of the food we were giving out wasn't necessarily culturally or familially comfortable or understandable. In South County, there's a lot of kids and families that work in the agricultural community. They don't know what a granola bar is. And so they were like, well, we appreciate the food, but this just isn't, sure. Again, when you go shop, you buy food your family wants and needs, right? It's part of your foundational elements to your family. So we thought, we're a smart organization. We're a bunch of bright people. We'll figure this out. So we started to look at culturally relevant foods. We could figure that out. And then we also started to put soups and stews, things like that, into the backpack. Now the kid's going home with 30 pounds of food, literally.
Wow.
Not easy. But we felt pretty good that we had started to solve some of the underlying problems until the professor that from USF of anthropology that sits on our board, Dr. David Himmelgreen, said, well, you have a bigger problem than that. And we said, well, what's that? He said, you're placing the child in a position of responsibility to feed their family. You cannot do that to a child. Right. Right? That's the last backpack we ever did. So what did we do? We looked around, we talked to some folks, and we started to build pantries inside of schools. So now if you go to, we have 75 or 80 different pantries inside schools, elementary schools, other places around the community. When mom or dad come and pick up their child on campus, they can go into a little pantry and shop, right? And shop is a familiar term, not buy, but just get the groceries that they need, pick up their child and head home. It allowed us to feed the entire family. We didn't focus so much on the kid themselves, although the food we have inside the pantries and schools are, again, available to and helpful to the entire family, particularly to the children. So now you're getting at the entirety of whether, even though the pantry might be inside an elementary school, if there's a high schooler in the household, that person's going to get those resources. But to finish your question, one of the reasons why we have conversations like this with organizations like yours is because we need far more attention to the matter. We need far more understanding of how do we make sure our community is aware of this? How do we build out resources, programs, interventions, prevention programs that start to change this long-term narrative?
Thomas, talk to me a little bit about, because you've said a couple times nutritious food.
Yes.
Right? So we all know there's a difference between the food that is in the food deserts, which if you could also describe what a food desert is too for us. Yeah. How do you get nutritious food to people? The food that is not just the preservatives or sits on the shelf.
Yeah. It's a challenge for sure. probably about 5 or 6 years ago, we made a commitment as an organization to make sure that 70% of all foods we provided were healthy. As you and I would both know, there's nothing wrong with a Diet Coke or a birthday cake, right? These are things that are important to have on the table too. But if those are your steady diet, it's not going to lead to long-term success for a child or anybody else in the household. So to answer your question specifically, food desert is where there is not a grocery store that has a wide variety of items for sale, typically within 1.5 miles of your household. Depends on whether you're talking urban or rural, what that looks like, but you can use the basic definition. The other one that we pay attention to, Jenny, which is just as important, is food swamps. And a food swamp is where there are preponderance of fast food restaurants. So think about a road you're driving down. And you suddenly come upon an area where all the different fast food places show up. That's what we consider a food swamp. And that becomes a primary food source for a lot of families. Why? Because it's tasty, it's convenient, and it's cheap. Right? And so you go back to what we talked about before, time, distance, money.
Yeah.
Right? They're solving for it. And again, there's nothing wrong with the occasional fast food meal.
Sure.
Not at all. Right?
And by the way, we both know too that fast food is no longer necessarily cheap either.
It is not.
Right.
So both of those definitions are things we pay attention to. And we think about how we care for communities. We're pretty aware of what's in every zip code we serve, right? What are the circumstances in that zip code? So the good news with the state of Florida is we have a tremendous amount of good, healthy, perishable foods available. Our state grows them. There are opportunities across the state to collect food that otherwise would be go back into the ground. So for your listener, how does that work?
Yeah.
When a farmer grows a particular product, they grow fields of cucumbers or fields of tomatoes. When they harvest all of that, some of that product is not fit for the retail consumption. Why? Because when you go shop for a cucumber, if it's not the right color or size, you won't select that. When you go shop for a tomato, if it's not the right color or size, a consumer won't select that. But the items can still be terrifically valuable and usable and every bit as good. But again, the major retail marketplace won't buy them. We collect all of those, right? So think about all of that. It's maybe the cucumber's too big or the tomatoes a little bit greener than orange. All of these are terrifically valuable pieces of produce. We get our hands on all of that. We work with farming communities all over the state to make sure instead of them plowing that over, we then collect it and get that into the community. So that's where we get a lot of good, healthy produce, which is one of the key products that we want to put on tables. And then let me share a story that's now 2 weeks old. And it's kind of funny to think about it this way. We had the Commissioner of Agriculture, Wilton Simpson, into our food bank about a month ago with a bunch of dairy farmers. And the dairy farmers were explaining a challenge that they had and trying to work with the Agricultural Commissioner about how they could manage that. And if I get my numbers right, basically what they said was as a group of farmers, dairy farmers, during the school year, the school systems across the state buy 22 tankers of milk a day from our collective farms. During the summer, they buy 7 tankers a week. And we still have all the cows who still have all the milk. And we're destroying it. Why should we do that?
Right.
And the commissioner said, we agree. And so we're going to put in a place where during the summer, food banks like ours, but across the state, can step in and gather that excess dairy, which is really important to the kids that we serve and the families that we serve. But we're also going to do this with eggs and other proteins where there is excess throughout our community. So there's plenty of excess available. We as an organization just need more resources to go collect it and move it.
So when somebody comes to Feeding Tampa Bay or to one of your locations, what do they get? Do they get what they ask for, or do they get prepared foods, or how?
Yeah, let me digress a little bit and talk about this because I think it's an important part of what we do. Sometimes in the charitable system, the viewpoint of people in the charitable system is that they have made choices that have put them there. They have not lived up to their obligations or responsibilities as a citizen or a parent. And again, I said this before and I'm going to say it again. I cannot refute that notion strongly enough. Let me give you a for instance, going back to those school pantries. You know who else is using the school pantries on our campuses? Teachers. The staff at schools. So the very people that we trust the education of our children to are also having to access our services because we don't pay them enough. That's families. Who we're serving. Right? So when we think about this, the folks we're feeding are friends and neighbors, people just like you and I. We don't like to use the term them. We like to use the term us. And so it's important to understand, who is our neighbor. But also, when you think about yourself as a family, take me through for a moment a shopping that you do. Tell me how you shop and what's the way in which you go about going through the grocery store. What goes through your mind? What is it that's important to you?
Thinking about meals and
do you have kids at home? Or they, yes. Right? So
I have a middle schooler.
All right.
So thinking about what she's going to eat, what I can buy that's healthy, that she'll eat, and planning for meals for the week.
Yeah. Right? And so when you walk up and down the aisles, you're surveying the items that are important to you. You know what your daughter likes. You know what your husband likes. You know the meals that are familiar to you as a family. Right? You probably cook recipes that came down from a generation ago that are important to you. These things define who you are as a human being. They also define who you are as a family. They also define who we are as a culture. And so when people are food insecure, they lose all that. Because if you're just handing them a box of food and saying, here, eat, they lose their sense of identity too. You're already in a tough enough spot as a human when you have to come in for our services. We want to make sure you can choose your food. So if you come to our grocery store on our campus, you shop. You get the items that we have. We don't always have everything, but whatever we have, you choose the items that are important to you, that are familiar to you, that your family wants. And as much as we can across all of our food distributions, we want them to be client choice. Because we want to make sure that everything that someone does has a measure of dignity attached to it. That when they come into our care, we're not only able to say, here are the products and services we can offer you, but here is our humanity that we want to have come alongside that so you don't feel alone, you don't feel judged, you don't feel like you're lost and alone. You feel like you've walked into a place where someone cares for you and about you. We think this is just as critically important as obtaining food is the way in which we go about it. And interestingly, again, for your listeners, because again, I get the question all the time about people abusing services and folks that, right? And again, we never see this. Interestingly, when we went to client choice, the amount of food taken per person went down, right?
Interesting.
Right. And when we ask why, two answers. One is, well, we only take what we can use. And number two is, I've had to stand in this line too. I don't want to ever take from somebody else that might have to stand in this line also.
Wow.
Right.
Do you find that people go in and out of food insecurity? Or is it like once they're food insecure?
There's a wide variety of data about that. And you asked early on in the program today, what are the shifting economics? Food relief and other charitable service were generally built to say, I have a crisis. I have to make my way through. Once the crisis is resolved, I can move back to a place of self-determination and self-sustenance. We see more and more that that's not the case. In fact, one of the things we would say to someone who wanted to describe our world, we would often say that we're the fourth week of someone's month. Right? You have enough income to get through 3 weeks, but your fourth week, you're struggling to assemble the resources to kind of keep your family afloat. And so more and more, Jenny, I think we see people that are using our services as an ongoing part of their strategy for household safety and security. Right? So they may have income to get through 3 weeks, but on their fourth week, they may know that they're making a trip to Feeding Tampa Bay or, one of our partners because they have to access resources, right? The other thing that we have found is that there are a lot of economic cliffs out there that the folks we face, but usually what happens in our care is when someone has an economic shock, it generally reverberates over a much longer period in a household today than it used to. I don't know if I'm exactly right on this, but I'm going to be close. I think in the state of Florida, the average household has $600 in savings, right? So that is 2 tires, that is a car repair, that is a medical bill. When that's exhausted, the teetering begins. And what happens is when folks start to get behind, you probably remember when you were a kid, your parents talked to you about the magic of compounding in your savings account. Put more in, it starts to gain interest. That same compounding works on the opposite side. When you get behind a little, you start to get behind a lot. And so we see people that are unable to recover over a longer term. And so we probably have more folks in our care today that are an ongoing part of our world, and we are an ongoing part of theirs. To put a fine point on it for your listeners, think about it this way. For you and I, we probably spend 35% of our discretionary income, on our household income on housing costs, food, and transportation, right? For the folks that we serve, generally it's around 55%.
Okay.
What are the prices of those 3 things over the last 4 years?
They've gone way up.
Correct. And so families are struggling. I think it's the timeliness of what you're talking about in the podcast today is the struggle is more difficult, a tougher solve than it ever has been. And I want to make sure that we come back to the point of the podcast, which is what happens for children when this occurs, right? You all would know probably better than us, but the listener should certainly understand. If children do not have access to nutritious food, no matter where their age range is, you could talk about what happens at 1.5 to 2.5 years and what happens genetically if kids do not have food. You can talk about what happens socially and otherwise if kids don't have food from 2, 3, 4, 5, once they enter the education system. I think for all of us to come back to the finest point of this, which is if we can't find a way to feed children as communities, our long-term prospects are far more different than we might want or think is right. There's a moral responsibility we have to make sure that children are fed. We would also tell you that there is a long-term impact on communities where children don't have access to basic needs, sustenance, housing, food, and other resources.
Can you expand on that?
Sure. So when a child doesn't have resources in their household, when the household is struggling, when it has trauma as on an ongoing basis, the ability of that child to make their way through the education system, the ability of the family to withstand those economic shocks and other things we talked about becomes significantly compromised. Those kids aren't necessarily completing school. They aren't necessarily going on to secondary education. They aren't necessarily able to transition from education into jobs. These are things that we have to think about what makes a healthy community. And so what might seem like the problem of one child in one place in one family quickly escalates and snowballs into a problem of a community. You know, we here in Tampa Bay want to say that, hey, we're a great place to live and we're folks that have a lot of opportunity and we're an area where there's a lot of prosperity and opportunity. And we would agree those things are true. Our observation would be they have to be true for everybody.
Right.
That if we're going to have the communities we want to live in, we're going to have to address those issues. And you and I are both products. I'm probably a fair bit older than you, but you and I are products of people who made sure our communities were capable for us, that the teachers in our schools were paid appropriately so that they could educate our children, that the resources and services available for those that didn't quite have enough to make it were there so that they could move their way through and become productive members of society. These are things I think we have to start to say, what is our responsibility to that and for that? Because one, there's a moral argument to be made that we have a responsibility to do this. I would certainly buy into that personally. But the other argument to be made is if we want successful, healthy communities, it means that everybody has to live into those standards and opportunities as well. It can't just be the few.
It has to be the entire community.
Yes. Yes, I'm a New Jersey kid. And so I grew up with Bruce Springsteen and followed him my whole career. But I remember standing at a concert in probably 1982 or 83, maybe 84. And he was at the time supporting food banks around the United States. But one of the things he said when he talked about supporting the local food bank was, nobody wins unless everybody wins. Mm. And I believe that philosophically. It's why I do the work I do today. Because I believe we have an obligation to make sure everybody wins. And that doesn't mean taking anything away from anyone else. It doesn't have to be reductive. It can be additive, right? Taking care of other people doesn't mean you have to give me what you have and you don't have. It means that collectively we say, let's find ways to do this differently. Let me go back to Causeway Center. The people that helped us fund it, the board of directors that helped support this effort, we built 35% of the people space there on that campus will not be used by Feeding Tampa Bay. It'll be used by the community. In other words, we could have built a building that was 35% less expensive just to be a food bank, but it wasn't the right thing to do. And those that helped us build it, that supported it, that stood in with us said, we believe in a different vision. We believe in trying to do something that is bigger, bolder, but much more likely to change narratives and outcomes in our community. That's what we have to do. And that's additive. It's not reductive and it doesn't subtract. It builds. And I think that's what we all have to understand going back to the children in our community. We all ought to agree that's a good place to start.
100%. I know that Feeding Tampa Bay is focused on, intervention, prevention, and policy. Talk to us a little bit about, you've talked about intervention for sure, but talk to us a little bit more about prevention and also policy.
Well, one of the best definitions of prevention in our world is make sure kids eat when they're kids. If you want the outcome,
sure.
Right. One of the things as a society we generally have gotten comfortable with is interventions are usually more expensive, less effective. Prevention, less expensive, more effective. So one of the things we want to do is start to work our way back upstream. So when someone comes into us and they have a particular series of problems, can we figure out what the origin of that is and can we resolve that? Right. And then can we keep them from that same situation in the future? Here's a simple example of how we think about prevention. We have a job training program. That job training program puts people through either truck driving school, which is a Class B license, which is a coveted job here in Tampa. It puts you through warehouse logistics, 5 different certifications. Again, a coveted position here in Tampa. Both of those pay extraordinarily good wages. Right? You can live and make a good living in both of those industries. That's the best indicator of long-term success. I have personal agency capability created by myself. I can then look after myself. But there are all kinds of other preventions. We're working with healthcare providers to make sure that in the healthcare arena, for example, with Baycare, we have a program when they are bringing people that they have seen in the hospital who they have identified as food insecure out. We then, when they're identified, provide them with food for the first 3 to 4 days to a week of their post-recovery time at home because that prevents them from going back into the hospital. Because they were returning back to the hospital because they came home and took their medicine, but they didn't have any food to eat. So they weren't getting healthy, right? So prevention for us is working further and further upstream, trying to understand how we keep people from falling through or into a deeper hole than perhaps they were in when they came to see us, which also talks about policy. One of the best and long-term ways to ensure their communities are successful is with good, thoughtful policy decisions. Now, policy can be tricky because it becomes a conversation about politics, but that's not the conversation we want to have. Irrespective of a particular party's wants and needs, thoughtful policy can change outcomes in communities. Right? So let's think about something like SNAP or food stamps. So SNAP is Supplemental Assistance Program. Every year, the federal government allots a certain amount of money that comes down into the states that allows families that are at the poverty level and below to apply for and receive food stamps. The studies show that folks that receive those food stamps have a far greater likelihood of moving out of the need for those food stamps and moving back into a sustainable household than any other intervention program there is.
Interesting.
Yes, because it does what it's meant to do. It is a transitional level of support. It also keeps folks in a grocery store selecting the items that they want. And then once recovered, the family is able to move into a more successful, again, long-term sustenance. But food stamps have become politicized. But a few other things to think about the way we look at SNAP. For every dollar of SNAP, it's $1.77 economic value, because where are people spending their SNAP dollars? Grocery store.
The store, right.
Right? So those grocers pay taxes, right? That brings money back into the community. They pay wages. That brings job into the community. So as much as you might want to say, gee, I disagree with people getting SNAP, food stamps, the reality is it's an economic benefit to a much wider audience than just the individual receiving it. And by the by, just because the argument comes up over and over again, the ability to abuse SNAP is almost nil, right? It is very hard. You can't buy, we get asked all the time, can you buy cigarettes? Can you buy booze?
Auto tickets,
No.
all that, yeah.
No, you cannot. Nor do the people that get SNAP want to. Again, there's always somebody out there that's making the wrong decision for the wrong reason. But that said, the program is inordinately successful, right? But here's an example of how policy doesn't work. If you want to apply for SNAP today, so let's say, Jenny, you hit a hard patch and you and your family have to get SNAP assistance, you can go apply today. You will not receive that benefit for 90 days. There's a waiting period. Now, my guess is when you came to apply for that benefit, you were in trouble today.
Today. My kid's hungry today.
Right.
Yeah.
Why do we have to wait 90 days? Right. Now, there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. That's a good policy conversation we can have with elected officials to say, look, it's smarter for us to go ahead and waive that 90-day period, because if we get them into the store more quickly, we're much likely to prevent them from sliding further down the economic needs scale. So if this is their only need right now, we can address it. We can prevent it from becoming a greater need, right? So our argument would be the benefit's already there. Let's make sure we use that benefit so that it becomes effective and much more likely to be successful. One other example, because it relates to kids. The federal government has made funds available to the states over the last few years to feed kids over summer. Right, so about $250 million in supplemental food assistance to children has been available to the state of Florida the last couple of years. We have not taken that assistance. Now, there's a $12 million offset that the state would have to absorb to administer about half of the cost of administering the program. The state of Florida has declined that opportunity. About 17 states of the 50 have declined the opportunity, probably largely because of politics. But that is $250 million that we could spend on children over the summer to make sure that they are fed, so that when we return to the school year, they're far more likely to be successful and ready to be educated. But these are policy decisions that get made for a variety of different reasons. And I want to be clear to you and to the listeners, we don't care who's in lead of any policy party. We don't get involved in, we have just as many friends on either side of the aisle, it doesn't matter to us. But thoughtful policy is thoughtful policy. And if you want to change the greatest amount of capability in a community, it's with thoughtful policy. That doesn't always mean more money. Sometimes it means rethinking how you're delivering resources, as I just described in both of those instances. So policy allows us to have a conversation to say, what can we do to make sure that people have the widest variety of access to resources? Because going back to what I think makes a healthy community, I think there are three groups of people that have to have co-equal responsibility for a healthy community. The first is an organization like Feeding Tampa Bay in our industry. The non-governmental organizations that step in and provide services and gaps and other things. We have to be on our game. Corporations, as I mentioned before, who exist in communities, who are employers in communities, as I said, have to understand we're feeding either your customers or your colleagues or both. They have to have responsibility. And the third group that has to have responsibility is electeds and appointeds. If all three of those work thoughtfully together, anything can happen. And quite frankly, during COVID, we saw the best example of that we've ever seen. Money was made available through different programs that the government, again, no matter the administration, the government said we want to make sure that we can help people through this crisis. Corporations stepped up and in and made sure that there are resources. Nonprofit organizations made sure that those resources made its way through the community. And we, again, you could argue this, but we navigated a pretty difficult pandemic by working thoughtfully together. I think that can exist all the time. I am probably naive enough to believe that it's possible. And I think if folks understand all three of those groups, nonprofits, corporations, and electeds and appointeds, we all want the same outcome. All of us. You're not going to find any elected official that doesn't want kids to be healthy.
Right.
Not one.
Right.
I don't care who they are. There's not one that's going to say that's not a good idea.
So, Thomas, and you've obviously, as I mentioned before, you're running one of the largest food banks in the country. Do you see the same patterns of food insecurity and all these other issues throughout the country?
Yes, you do. So an organization like Feeding Tampa Bay is a part of the Feeding America network. There are 200 food banks just like us across the United States. We're one of the largest, as you mentioned, in terms of distribution and size and scope. But in every community, there is a food relief organization like ours making sure, I loved what you said at the start, that there's not a county in the United States that doesn't have food insecurity in it. Our job as a network, as a collective of food banks, is to make sure that there's food on the table in every one of those places. But we were in close contact with all of our peer groups. We worked together thoughtfully and collaboratively, but all of our communities are having these struggles because the economics in West Virginia or North Texas or Oregon, every community is struggling with how do you make sure that the base and the largest part of your citizenry has access to resources. So no matter where you are, there's a struggle at some level happening in an urban setting, in rural settings, in suburban settings. Folks are having difficulty making their way through their basic obligations. It's not just here in Tampa, Florida. It's a national issue. Feeding America would tell you that there are some 36 to 38 million people who are food insecure right now. And that's just food insecure. Again, as I mentioned, economically unstable is a bigger number.
Thomas, for our listeners who are everywhere, what is something that we can each do individually to help guard against food insecurity or help other people along? And especially because of what we're doing with this podcast, kids.
Yeah. I think that we all have to understand no one makes it alone. Every single one of us has had another human being, institution, organization step in and help. If we understand that that's been our story, then let's make sure it's someone else's story too. Step in and help. You don't have to get involved in food insecurity necessarily. You might get involved when you think about kids with guardian ad litem. You might get involved in education opportunities to read to kids. You might get involved in advocacy for children. Whatever it is, you have an obligation and a responsibility to yourself, to your family, to your community to say, I'm going to help. And that doesn't always mean I'm going to write checks. I think that's become the belief that everybody has to do. The greatest asset any human has is the value of their time and their capability. Go volunteer. Step up, step in. If we want great communities, they're going to be built by us, not by someone else. They're going to be because we say, hey, collectively, we all think this is important and we're going to be a part of it too. Look up your organization. Find out how to get involved. Find out the issues that you're aware of, right? That you care about. It should be around understanding what's happening in the places I live today, right? I think my own belief, my conviction is if you want a great community, make sure you're a part of making it a great community.
Thomas, you truly are the center of our community, and we appreciate everything you and your team is doing.
Jenny, thank you. I'm excited for what your organization's going to do. I'm excited to be a part of the podcast and appreciate being able to spend some time with you.
Thank you. Please come back and talk about more food.
We will.
Okay, take care.
Thanks for spending your time with Think Bigger Voices. Visit thinkbigforkids.org/podcast to see more episodes, follow our journey, and stay connected.